The fabric tore with a sound that changed everything. Malachi Brooks stood waist-deep in the churning river, holding fragments of wet cloth in his trembling hands. The woman was breathing, alive, safe. But the torn pieces of her traditional dress, floating downstream, told a different story to the eyes watching from the ridge above. He had pulled her from certain death, so why was she staring at him with such terror in her dark eyes? Why was she backing away from him like he was the danger? She had just escaped? The rain hammered against his hat as he tried to understand. In his world, saving someone meant gratitude. In his world, torn clothing was a small price for a saved life. But standing there watching her clutch the remaining fabric to her chest, while scanning the tree line with desperate eyes, Malachi began to realize he wasn't in his world anymore. 3 hours earlier, Malachi had been tracking his missing cattle through the canyon when the storm hit without warning. The sky had turned black as coal, and the wind carried a violence that bent trees nearly in half. He should have sought shelter immediately, should have turned back to his small ranch house and waited out the tempest like any sensible man would do. Instead, he heard the screaming. Human voices don't sound like animal cries, no matter how desperate. This was different. This was terror in its purest form, cutting through the howling wind like a blade through silk. Without thinking, Malachi spurred his horse toward the sound, following it down the rocky slope to where the normally calm stream had become a raging torrent. That's where he saw her. The woman was caught in the current, her long black hair whipping around her face as the water pulled her toward the rapids downstream. Her traditional dress, heavy with water, was dragging her down. She fought against the river with everything she had, but the storm had turned the peaceful waterway into a liquid beast with teeth of stone and foam. Malachi didn't hesitate. He dove from his horse directly into the churning water, the cold hitting him like a physical blow. The current immediately seized him, trying to sweep him away with the same merciless force that held the woman. But Malachi was strong, his years of ranch work having built muscle and endurance that served him well in moments like these. He reached her just as her strength began to fail. Her eyes met his for one brief instant, and he saw something there that would haunt him later. Not just fear of drowning, fear of him, fear of being touched by a stranger, fear of what her rescue might cost her. But there was no time for gentle considerations. The rapids loomed ahead, and Malachi knew that hesitation meant death for both of them. He grabbed her around the waist, feeling the fabric of her dress bunch in his grip. As he pulled her toward the shore, fighting against the current's relentless pull, he heard the material begin to strain and tear, the sound of ripping cloth, mixed with her sharp intake of breath. But they were alive, and that was all that mattered. Or so Malachi thought until he saw the faces emerging from the forest above. Sometimes the worst misunderstandings begin with the best intentions. The warriors stood silhouetted against the storm clouds, their figures dark and menacing along the ridge. From their vantage point, they could see everything. Malachi holding the torn fabric, the woman backing away from him with her clothing damaged, and the fear written across her face. What they couldn't see was the truth. Ayanna pressed herself against the muddy riverbank, her dark eyes darting between Malachi and the growing number of shapes appearing through the rain. She spoke rapidly in her native tongue, words tumbling over each other in desperate urgency. Though Malachi couldn't understand the language, the panic in her voice was universal. "I was trying to help," Malachi said quietly, raising his hands to show he meant no harm. But his words seemed to increase her distress rather than calm it. She shook her head violently, pointing toward the warriors above. Then she did something that confused Malachi even more. She grabbed dirt from the riverbank and began rubbing it on her arms and face as if trying to hide evidence of something. Her movements were frantic, desperate. A war cry echoed across the canyon, harsh and guttural, followed by answering calls from multiple directions. The sound made Malachi's blood run cold. He had heard tales of frontier conflicts, but had never experienced the primal terror of being outnumbered by armed warriors in their own territory. Ayanna suddenly grabbed Malachi's arm, her grip surprisingly strong. For a moment he thought she might be asking for protection. Instead, she pushed him away from her with such force that he stumbled backward into the shallow water. "Go," she whispered in heavily accented English. "They will kill you." But it was already too late for escape. The first warrior had begun making his way down the steep canyon wall, moving with the fluid grace of someone who knew every rock and root. Others followed, their descent creating a cascade of loose stones that clattered into the water below. Malachi counted at least 12 figures, though the rain made it difficult to be certain. They carried traditional weapons, bows, war clubs, and steel blades that gleamed despite the gray light. Their faces were painted for war, and their intentions were unmistakable. The lead warrior reached the bottom of the canyon and stepped into the river without hesitation. He was a large man, powerfully built, with graying hair braided with feathers and beads. His eyes locked onto Malachi with a hatred so intense it was almost physical. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority. Though Malachi couldn't understand the words, their meaning was clear enough. This was judgment, and it had already been passed. Ayanna threw herself between the two men, speaking rapidly to the warrior leader. Her voice was pleading, desperate. But the man's expression didn't change. If anything, seeing her torn clothing and muddy condition seemed to fuel his rage. More warriors splashed into the river surrounding Malachi in a loose circle. Their weapons remained lowered but ready. They were waiting for something, a signal, a word from their leader, permission to act on what they believed they had witnessed. Malachi realized with growing dread that everything he had done to save, this woman's life, was being interpreted as an attack upon her honor. Every tear in her dress, every smudge of dirt on her skin, every sign of struggle was evidence against him, and the most damning evidence of all was still clutched in his hands, the torn pieces of her sacred clothing floating like accusations in the churning water around them. The lead warrior raised his war club, and Malachi understood that his time for explanations had run out. The truth can be more dangerous than lies when no one wants to hear it. The war club froze in midair as a new voice cut through the rain, deep, commanding, and carrying absolute authority. The lead warrior immediately lowered his weapon and stepped back, though his eyes never left Malachi's face. Through the storm came another figure, older than the others, moving with the careful dignity of someone whose every step commanded respect. This man wore no war paint, but the feathers in his graying hair and the intricate beadwork on his leather vest marked him as someone of great importance. Ayanna's entire body went rigid when she saw him. She whispered a single word that sounded like both reverence and terror. "Father." Dakota surveyed the scene with dark eyes that missed nothing. He saw his daughter's torn clothing, the fear on her face, the white man standing waist-deep in their sacred river holding pieces of her dress. He saw the circle of warriors ready for blood and the tension that crackled in the air like lightning, waiting to strike. When he spoke, it was in his native tongue, but his tone made translation unnecessary. He was asking questions, and he expected answers. Ayanna responded rapidly, her voice shaking. She gestured toward the river, toward Malachi, toward the torn fabric floating in the water. Her father listened without interruption, his expression growing darker with each word. Malachi watched this exchange with growing dread. He could see the moment when Dakota's face hardened into a mask of controlled rage. Whatever Ayanna was telling him, it wasn't helping Malachi's cause. But then something unexpected happened. Ayanna suddenly pulled off a leather pouch that hung around her neck and thrust it toward her father. Dakota took it, examined its contents, and his entire demeanor shifted. The rage remained, but now it seemed directed elsewhere. He barked an order to his warriors. Several of them immediately began searching the riverbank, looking for something specific. Others spread out along the canyon walls, their eyes scanning the rocks and trees with newfound purpose. "What is it?" Malachi asked, though he knew Dakota probably didn't speak English. "What are they looking for?" To his surprise, the tribal leader turned to him and spoke in heavily accented but clear English. "They look for the men who chase my daughter into the river." The words hit Malachi like a physical blow. Men who chased her plural, which meant Ayanna hadn't fallen into the water by accident. She had been running from something or someone. "How many men?" Malachi asked. Dakota's eyes narrowed. "You do not know, you were not with them. I was tracking my cattle when I heard screaming. That's when I found her in the water." For a long moment, Dakota studied Malachi's face with the intensity of someone who had learned to read truth and deception in a man's eyes. The silence stretched between them, filled only by the sound of rain and the rushing river. Finally, Dakota spoke again. "My daughter says you saved her life. She also says 3 men on horses drove her to the water's edge, men with yellow hair and pale eyes like you." The implication was clear. Even if Malachi hadn't been one of the attackers, he looked like them. In the eyes of the tribe that made him guilty by association, one of the searching warriors called, out from upstream. He held something in his hand, something that made Dakota's face go dark as thunder, a piece of cloth, blue cloth, not from Ayanna's traditional dress, but from a white man's shirt. And in the growing twilight, more war cries began echoing through the canyon, not from the warriors already present, but from others approaching fast, many others. The sound came from all directions now, surrounding them completely. When you're surrounded by 200 warriors, prayer becomes mathematics. The war cries grew louder, closer, until they seemed to come from the rocks themselves. Malachi turned in a slow circle, watching as figures emerged from every shadow, every crevice, every possible hiding place in the canyon. They moved like water flowing downhill, inevitable and unstoppable. Dakota's expression had shifted from controlled anger to something far more dangerous, the cold calculation of a leader preparing for war. The piece of blue cloth in the warrior's hand had changed everything. It was evidence that white men had indeed been here, had indeed pursued his daughter to this place. But Malachi was the only white man they could see. 200, Ayanna whispered in English, her voice barely audible above the rain. "Maybe more. They have been hunting the yellow-haired ones for 3 days. Malachi's stomach dropped. 3 days? Which meant this hadn't been a random attack on Ayanna. This had been part of something larger, something planned, and now he was caught in the middle of it. "What did those men do?" he asked. Ayanna glanced at her father, then back at Malachi. Her next words came out in a rush, as if she needed to get them out before her courage failed. "They came to our camp during the new moon ceremony, took our sacred objects, killed 2 elders who tried to stop them, said they would return for more unless we gave them safe passage through our land." The picture was becoming clearer, and it was worse than Malachi had imagined. These weren't random thieves. They were men who understood exactly how to wound a tribe most deeply. Taking sacred objects during a religious ceremony was more than theft. It was desecration. Dakota spoke sharply to his daughter, clearly displeased that she was sharing their business with a stranger. But Ayanna continued anyway, her voice growing stronger. "I followed them when they left camp, wanted to see which direction they went to help our warriors track them. But they saw me, chased me through the forest, until I had nowhere left to run except into the water." More pieces of the puzzle fell into place. Ayanna hadn't been a victim in the wrong place at the wrong time. She had been a scout gathering intelligence for her tribe. Her torn dress wasn't just evidence of Malachi's rescue. It was evidence of her own courage. The warriors continued to descend into the canyon, their numbers seeming endless. Many carried torches that hissed and sputtered in the rain, creating a hellish light that danced across their painted faces. They arranged themselves in perfect formation, cutting off every possible escape route. Malachi realized with growing horror that he was about to become the scapegoat for crimes he hadn't committed. In the tribe's eyes, one white man was as good as another when it came to justice. They had been hunting for 3 days, and they had finally found their prey. Dakota raised his hand, and the war cries fell silent. The sudden quiet was more terrifying than the noise had been. In that silence, Malachi could hear his own heartbeat, the rain hitting the water and the soft whisper of arrows being notched to bowstrings. "You have 2 choices, white man," Dakota said, his English precise and cold. "Tell us where the yellow-haired ones have gone or pay the price for their crimes yourself." Malachi opened his mouth to protest his innocence, but Dakota cut him off with a sharp gesture. "My daughter says you saved her life. For this, I will give you 1 chance to prove you are not like the others. But if you cannot lead us to the real thieves, he didn't need to finish the sentence." The 200 warriors surrounding them, their weapons ready and their faces painted for war, made the consequences clear enough. Ayanna stepped forward, placing herself between Malachi and her father once again. When she spoke, her voice carried a desperation that made Malachi's chest tighten. "Father, there is something else. Something I found before they chased me." She reached into the torn remains of her dress and pulled out a small object, something she had hidden close to her body throughout the ordeal. Even in the dim light, Malachi could see what it was. A military button, brass with an eagle design, and suddenly everything changed again. Sometimes the enemy of your enemy becomes your only hope for survival. The military button gleamed in Dakota's palm like a brass accusation. The eagle design was unmistakable, and Malachi recognized it immediately. Fort Carson, the nearest military outpost, was 3 days' hard ride to the east, but what would soldiers be doing this far from their assigned territory? Dakota's warriors shifted restlessly, their weapons still trained on Malachi, but their attention now focused on this new piece of evidence. The implications were staggering. If soldiers were involved in the theft of sacred objects, this wasn't just a criminal matter anymore. This was a potential act of war between the United States military and the tribe. "Where did you find this?" Dakota asked his daughter, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Near the old oak tree where they stopped to divide what they had stolen," Ayanna replied. "One of them lost it when they were arguing about which direction to take." Malachi's mind raced. He knew the oak tree she meant. A massive ancient tree that marked the boundary between tribal land and the open territory that led toward Fort Carson. It was also a known stopping point for travelers heading east. If the thieves had paused there to argue, it meant they weren't sure of their destination. They were running, not returning to base. "Those weren't soldiers," Malachi said suddenly. All eyes turned to him, and he felt the weight of 200 warriors' attention like a physical pressure. At least not active duty soldiers. Dakota's eyes narrowed. "How do you know this?" "Because I know the commanding officer at Fort Carson, Colonel Matthews. He's a good man, an honorable man. He would never authorize an attack on your people, especially not during a religious ceremony." Malachi paused, thinking through the possibilities. But deserters. Deserters would still have their uniforms, their buttons, their knowledge of military tactics. The pieces were falling into place now. Deserters would know how to move through hostile territory, how to plan an attack, how to escape quickly. They would also be desperate enough to steal anything of value, sacred or not. And most importantly, they would have no official protection if caught. Ayanna stepped forward, her torn dress still clutched around her like armor. "There is more. When they were arguing, I heard one of them say something about a ship, about getting to the coast before anyone could follow them." A ship? That changed everything. If the deserters were trying to reach the coast, they weren't planning to hide in the wilderness. They were planning to disappear entirely, probably to California or Mexico, where military justice couldn't easily reach them. But it also meant they would have to travel through settler territory to reach the ocean. Territory where Malachi had contacts, friends, people who owed him favors from years of honest dealing. "I can help you track them," Malachi said. The words, coming out before he fully realized what he was offering. "I know the trails they'll have to take to reach the coast. I know the people who run the supply stations, the ferry operators, the innkeepers. If these men are trying to flee the territory, I can help you find them." The silence that followed was deafening. Dakota studied Malachi with those dark, penetrating eyes, weighing the offer against the risk. Around them, his warriors waited for their leader's decision, their faces painted for war, but their discipline holding them in check. "And why would you do this?" Dakota asked finally. "Why would you risk your life to help us recover what was stolen from our people?" Malachi looked at Ayanna, remembering the terror in her eyes when she thought her own people might not believe her story. Remembering the courage it had taken for her to scout the thieves alone. Remembering the desperation in her voice when she had tried to protect him from her father's warriors. "Because what those men did was wrong," he said simply. "Because your daughter saved my life by telling you the truth when she could have stayed silent, and because sometimes the right thing to do is also the only thing to do." Dakota was quiet for a long moment. Then he turned to his warriors and spoke in rapid, authoritative tones. Malachi couldn't understand the words, but he could see the effect they had. Weapons were lowered, postures relaxed slightly. The immediate threat of violence began to recede. But when Dakota turned back to Malachi, his expression was still deadly, serious. "If you are lying to us, white man, if you lead us into a trap, or try to warn your people of our approach, you will not live to regret it." Malachi nodded, accepting the threat as the necessary price of trust. "I understand." "Good," Dakota said. "Because we ride at first light, and if we do not find these thieves within 3 days, you will take their place on the judgment ground. The hardest trails to follow are the ones that lead toward redemption." Dawn broke gray and cold with storm clouds still hanging low over the canyon. Malachi sat by a small fire watching Ayanna tend to her father's warhorse with practiced efficiency. She had braided her long hair tightly and changed into riding clothes, leather pants, and a simple shirt that allowed for quick movement. The torn ceremonial dress had been carefully folded and given to one of the elder women to repair. In the growing light, Malachi could see the full scope of Dakota's war party. Nearly 50 warriors had been selected for the pursuit, all mounted on strong horses and carrying enough supplies for a week-long chase. The rest remained behind to protect the tribal lands, but their weapons stayed ready in case this turned out to be more than just a hunt for 3 deserters. "You know these men better than you said yesterday," Ayanna observed, settling beside him near the fire. Her English was clearer now, less accented than her father's. "I could see it in your eyes when we talked about the military button." Malachi studied her face, surprised by her perceptiveness. "What makes you think that?" "Because when my father mentioned deserters, you weren't surprised. You were angry." She poked at the fire with a stick, sending sparks up into the dim morning light. Angry like someone who has seen what such men can do before. She was right, and Malachi saw no point in denying it. 3 years ago, a group of deserters attacked a homestead about 20 miles from my ranch, killed a family, stole their horses and supplies. I was part of the group that tracked them down. Did you catch them? 2 of them. The 3rd got away. Malachi's jaw tightened at the memory. He had yellow hair and pale eyes, just like your description. His name was Sergeant Pike, and he was the worst of the bunch. Smart, ruthless, and completely without conscience. Ayanna's stick stopped moving. "You think he is one of the 3 who attacked our ceremony? I'd bet my ranch on it." Pike always worked with the same 2 men, Corporal Jennings and Private Walsh. All 3 of them deserted together after the homestead killings. The army's been looking for them ever since. This information changed everything. They weren't just chasing random thieves anymore. They were pursuing known killers, men who had already proven they would murder innocents without hesitation, men who would not surrender peacefully when cornered. Dakota approached their fire, his expression grim. "My scouts have found their trail," he announced. They headed east, through Willow Pass, just as you predicted, but they are not alone anymore. Malachi felt his stomach drop. How many? At least 6 riders now, maybe 7. The tracks are difficult to read in the wet ground, but it appears they met with others sometime during the night. 6 or 7 men instead of 3. The odds had just shifted dramatically against them, and everyone knew it. Even 50 tribal warriors would be hard-pressed to defeat 7 desperate deserters in open country, especially if those deserters had military training and modern weapons. But there was something else in Dakota's expression, something that made Malachi's skin crawl with apprehension. "What is it?" Ayanna asked, reading her father's face with the same perceptiveness she had shown with Malachi. Dakota held up a piece of paper, folded and water-stained, but still readable. "One of my scouts found this pinned to a tree near their camp. It appears to be intended for us." Malachi took the paper and unfolded it carefully. The writing was in a rough, uneducated hand, but the words were clear enough to the savages following us. "We have your sacred trinkets, and we ain't giving them back. Keep coming after us, and we'll burn every one of them before we throw the ashes in the nearest river. You got 1 day to turn around and go home. After that, your precious holy things become kindling. S. Pike." The message hit Malachi like a physical blow. Pike not only knew they were being followed, but he was using the stolen sacred objects as leverage. This wasn't just theft anymore. This was psychological warfare designed to force the tribe into an impossible choice. Abandon the pursuit and let the desecration stand or risk watching their most precious religious artifacts be destroyed in front of them. Ayanna read the note over Malachi's shoulder, her breath catching when she reached Pike's name. "You were right. It is the same man." "There's more," Dakota said grimly. The scout who found this also discovered something else at their camp. Evidence that they have been in contact with other groups, other deserters, other outlaws. This Pike has been building an army. Malachi's blood ran cold. An army of deserters and criminals, all united under Pike's leadership, all armed, all desperate, and all willing to kill anyone who got in their way. And somewhere ahead of them, Pike was waiting with the tribe's most sacred possessions, daring them to come and try to take them back. "How long until we reach Willow Pass?" Malachi asked. Dakota's smile was cold as winter wind. "If we ride hard, we can be there by sunset. But I fear that will not be soon enough to prevent Pike from carrying out his threats." As if summoned by his words, a column of black smoke began rising on the eastern horizon. Thick, dark smoke that spoke of things burning that were never meant to burn. Pike had begun destroying the sacred objects, and with each item that went up in flames, the chances of avoiding a full-scale war grew smaller and smaller. Some battles are won before the first shot is fired. The smoke grew thicker as they rode east, a black column against the gray sky that marked Pike's location as clearly as a signal fire. But Malachi recognized something in that smoke that made his heart race with hope rather than despair. It was too thin, too controlled to be the complete destruction of the sacred objects. Pike was burning something, but not everything. Not yet. "He's bluffing," Malachi called to Dakota as they crested a ridge overlooking the valley where the smoke originated. "Look at the smoke pattern. That's wet wood and leather burning, not ceremonial artifacts. He's trying to make us think he's destroying everything, but he's keeping the real treasures intact." Dakota reined in his horse and studied the smoke with experienced eyes. Around them, the 50 warriors spread out along the ridgeline, their weapons ready, but concealed from view below. In the valley, Malachi could see Pike's camp clearly now, 7 men arranged around a large fire, their horses picketed nearby, and, most importantly, several leather bundles that could only contain the stolen sacred objects. "Why would he keep them?" Ayanna asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Because he's planning to sell them," Malachi replied grimly. "There are collectors back east who pay good money for Indian artifacts." No questions asked. Pike's not just a killer. He's a businessman. Those objects are worth more to him whole than burned. The realization changed their entire tactical situation. Pike wasn't planning a final stand here. He was buying time, using the threat of destruction to keep the tribe at a distance while he arranged safe passage to the coast. The smoke was meant to panic them into either retreating or attacking recklessly. But Malachi knew Pike's weakness. The man was arrogant, convinced of his own cleverness. He would never expect his pursuers to see through his deception, especially not with the help of someone who understood his methods. There, Malachi pointed to a cluster of rocks about 200 yards from Pike's camp. That's where he'll have his lookouts posted. 2 men, maybe 3, watching the main approaches to the valley. Dakota nodded grimly. "My warriors can reach those rocks without being seen, but that still leaves 4 men in the camp itself, all armed and ready for trouble." 5 men, Malachi corrected. "Pike always keeps 1 man with the horses, ready to run if things go wrong. That's his escape plan. Sacrifice his men to buy himself time to flee with the most valuable objects." As if summoned by their words, a figure detached itself from Pike's camp and began moving toward their position. Not running, not sneaking, but walking with the confident stride of someone who believed he held all the advantages. "Flag of truce," Ayanna observed, pointing to the white cloth the approaching figure carried. But Malachi's blood ran cold when he recognized the man's build, his distinctive swagger. The way he held his head slightly tilted to the right, a habit developed after a partially healed ear injury years ago. "That's Pike himself," Malachi said. "He's coming to negotiate." The implications were staggering. Pike never exposed himself to danger unless he was absolutely certain of his position, which meant either he had reinforcements hidden somewhere or he had a plan so clever he believed it guaranteed his safety. Pike stopped about 50 yards from the ridge and cupped his hands around his mouth. "Malachi Brooks," he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the valley. "I know you're up there, you interfering fool. Come down and let's have ourselves a chat." Malachi felt every eye turned toward him. The fact that Pike knew his name, knew he was with the war party, meant the deserter had sources of information they hadn't anticipated. Someone had been watching them, reporting their movements, keeping Pike informed of their pursuit. "He knows you," Dakota said, his voice carefully, neutral, but his eyes sharp with suspicion. "How does he know you are here?" It was a fair question, and one that could reignite all the tribal suspicions about Malachi's true loyalties. But before he could answer, Pike called out again. "Bring the chief down with you, Brooks and the girl. I've got a proposition that might interest all of you." "Something about those pretty trinkets I've been collecting." Ayanna's hand moved instinctively to her knife. "It's a trap." "Of course, it's a trap," Malachi agreed. "But it might also be our only chance to get close enough to recover the sacred objects before he destroys them for real." Dakota was quiet for a long moment, weighing the risks against the potential rewards. Around them, his warriors waited for orders, their faces painted for war, but their discipline holding them in check. "What kind of proposition could a thief and murderer offer that we would consider?" Dakota asked finally. Pike seemed to hear the question despite the distance, and his laugh carried an edge of genuine amusement. "The kind that saves everybody a lot of killing, Chief. See, I've been thinking about our situation, and I believe we might be able to help each other out, but we'll need to discuss it face to face." He paused, then added with casual menace. "And if nobody comes down to chat in the next 5 minutes, I'll start with the smaller items. Work my way up to that beautiful ceremonial headdress. I know you're just dying to get back, the sacred headdress. Dakota's entire body went rigid at the mention of it. Malachi didn't need to understand tribal customs to recognize that Pike had just threatened something irreplaceable, something whose loss would be an unforgivable wound to the tribe's spiritual identity. In the distance, they could see Pike's men feeding more material into their fire, preparing to make good on their leader's threat. Time had just run out. Honor is not negotiable, but justice can be swift. Malachi, Dakota, and Ayanna descended into the valley with weapons visible, but not drawn. Pike waited for them with the relaxed confidence of a man who believed he controlled the situation completely. Up close, he looked exactly as Malachi remembered. Tall, lean, with pale eyes. That seemed to find amusement in other people's suffering. "Brooks," Pike said with a mock-friendly nod, "you always did have a talent for showing up where you weren't wanted, and you must be Chief Dakota. Heard a lot about you." All respectful, of course, Dakota's expression could have frozen water. "Speak your proposition, thief." Pike's smile widened, straight to business. "I like that. Here's the thing. I've got something you want, and you've got something I need. Namely, safe passage to the coast without 50 warriors breathing down my neck." "And in exchange," Malachi asked, though he already knew the answer wouldn't be acceptable, "I give you back half the trinkets, the less valuable ones, of course. Keep the really pretty pieces to fund my retirement." Pike's expression grew serious. "It's a fair deal, Chief. You get some of your holy things back. I get to live. Everybody wins. Except for the families you murdered 3 years ago," Malachi said quietly. "Except for the elders your men killed during the ceremony. Those people don't get to win anything." Pike shrugged. "Ancient history. Brooks. We're talking about the future here." Dakota stepped forward, his voice carrying the weight of absolute authority. "There will be no negotiation with murderers and thieves. Return what you have stolen. Surrender yourselves, for justice and your deaths will be quick." "See, that's where you're wrong, Chief," Pike said, his hand moving casually toward his weapon. "Because I've got insurance you don't know about." He whistled sharply, and from the rocks surrounding the valley came the distinctive sound of rifle hammers being pulled back. Not 2 or 3 weapons, but at least a dozen. Pike's reinforcements had been hidden all along, positioned to create a perfect crossfire that would cut down anyone in the valley floor. But Malachi had been expecting this. Pike always had a backup plan, and his backup plans always involved overwhelming firepower from concealed positions. That's why Malachi had given Dakota's warriors very specific instructions before they descended into the valley. Instructions based on 3 years of studying Pike's methods and learning from the mistakes that had let him escape before. Dakota showed no surprise at the sound of the hidden weapons. Instead, he simply raised his hand and gave a single sharp whistle of his own. The response was immediate and devastating. From positions Pike's men hadn't even considered, tribal warriors rose like shadows given form. They had spent the night moving into position, using skills passed down through generations to become invisible in terrain they knew better than any outsider ever could. The hidden riflemen found themselves looking down the shafts of arrows drawn by men who could put a shaft through a rabbit's eye at 50 paces. The standoff had become mutual, but the advantage had shifted to those who understood the ground they fought on. Pike's confidence cracked for the first time. "You sneaky," he stopped, himself realizing that threats would only accelerate the violence everyone could feel building in the air. "Your move, Pike," Malachi said calmly. "But before you decide, you should know that we found your inside source." Pike's face went pale. "What source?" "Tommy Chen, the trader who's been selling you information about tribal movements and settler activities. He's been playing both sides for months, telling you where to strike and warning you when pursuit was coming." Malachi's voice grew hard. He won't be a problem anymore. It was a bluff, but a calculated one. Malachi had suspected there was an informant based on Pike's detailed knowledge, and Chen was the only trader who had access to both settler and tribal information. Pike's reaction confirmed the guess. "Chen sold me out," Pike asked. Genuine shock in his voice. "Chen's dead," Dakota said flatly. "My warriors found him trying to flee toward the coast with stolen tribal silver. He talked before he died, another bluff. But Pike's shoulders sagged as he accepted it as truth. Without his information network, his carefully laid plans became worthless. He was just another outlaw with too many enemies and nowhere to run. "Last chance, Pike," Malachi said. "Surrender the sacred objects and face justice like a man. Or die here fighting a battle you can't win." Pike looked around the valley, counting warriors, measuring odds, calculating his chances. For a moment, Malachi thought he might actually surrender. Instead, Pike's hand went for his gun. He never cleared the holster. Dakota's war club took him in the temple with a sound like a melon dropping on stone. Pike collapsed instantly, his weapon falling unfired into the dust. The hidden riflemen, seeing their leader fall, began to panic, but Dakota's warriors were ready for them. Within seconds, the sounds of brief struggles echoed from the rocks, as the deserters were overwhelmed by opponents who knew every shadow, every hiding place, every escape route in their own territory. When the sounds died away, 7 men lay, dead or captured in the valley. The stolen sacred objects sat undamaged by the dying fire, their surfaces reflecting the morning sun like promises kept. Dakota knelt beside the leather bundles and began checking their contents. His face, which had been hard as granite throughout the confrontation, softened with relief as he confirmed that everything was intact. "It is all here," he said quietly. "Every piece. They did not destroy anything." Ayana moved to stand beside Malachi, her eyes bright with something that might have been admiration. "You knew he was lying about burning the artifacts. Pike was many things, but he wasn't wasteful. He never destroyed anything that could be turned into profit." Malachi looked down at the fallen deserter, feeling no satisfaction in the man's death, but considerable relief that his crimes had finally caught up with him. Dakota rose from examining the recovered objects and faced Malachi squarely. "You have proven yourself worthy of trust, Malachi Brooks. Your actions today have prevented war between our peoples and returned what was sacred to us. How can this debt be repaid?" Malachi thought about it for a moment, then smiled. "Let there be peace between your people and the settlers. Let this be remembered as the day when enemies became allies in the cause of justice." Dakota nodded gravely. "It will be so, and you will always be welcome in our lands." As the warriors began the process of securing their prisoners and preparing for the journey home, Ayana approached Malachi one last time. "Will we see you again?" she asked. "When you need a friend," he replied. "You'll know where to find me." The sun broke through the storm clouds at last, casting golden light across the valley where justice had been served and honor restored. In the distance, smoke from Pike's deceptive fire finally died away, taking with it the last traces of a threat that would never trouble anyone again. If you enjoyed this story, click the video on your screen now to watch another unforgettable Western tale where destiny and courage collide in ways you never expected. Don't forget to subscribe and consider a super chat to help us keep bringing you more stories like these. Your support means everything to us.